Really hot in here. Are you warm too? I am hot. I promise I won't take my shirt off. Okay, I've been telling stories all morning in my Sabbath school class about my trip to Israel. I saved 2 stories for you that I'm going to tell all of you. One of them was at the beginning of our trip and one of them at the end. In 2011, I went to Israel with a group of pastors from the Ohio Conference, and I really enjoyed it. Trish and I really did enjoy it, and we said if we ever got the chance, we'd do it again, because it was that just eye-opening and exciting. And so when this trip came up about a year ago that the Northern California pastors were going to be taking this trip to Israel, we jumped on it because we wanted to go back again. 7 years ago, the guide that we had was amazing. I tell you, I just loved him. He was great with stories. He'd sing with us on the bus. He would teach us Hebrew songs, and he had some really good stories, and I love the guy. But you know, there are close to 2,000 licensed tour guides in the nation of Israel, because tourism is pretty big. So I had no expectations that I'd ever see this guy again, but you know, I really had fond memories of him from 2011. We flew into Jordan, and we did the first 3 days of our tour was in Jordan. We went to Petra, we went to the Mount Nebo, the place where Moses died, and where he had seen the promised land, and then we went to the Jordan site, on the Jordan side of the baptismal site. So then they took us all the way down to the south, and then we were supposed to cross over into Israel. Now, the Middle East is pretty fractured. You know, we talk about a blended nation here, and you know, we want to get along, but racially they are very segregated there. Arabs and Jews don't like to hang out with each other. They actually want to kill each other. So we got to the border of Israel, and we had to give up our bus and our Arab guides that we had had for the first 3 days, and we had to walk through security. 2 checkpoints. We had to go through the Arabic security on the Jordanian side and then the Israeli security, and so we had to carry all of our bags. We had to send them through 2 sets of security, and we're walking across the parking lot, and we get to the Israeli side, and there's 3 more buses waiting for us there with a whole different set of guides. So we're walking across the parking lot, and there's Menachem, the guide that I had 7 years ago. And I ran over and I gave him a hug. And you don't know, I don't give people hugs. And I said, Menachem. And he looks at me. And I says, I know you do a lot of tours and you don't remember me. I said, you were my tour guide 7 years ago. But let me share one story with you, Menachem. Maybe you'll remember me. I said, Menachem, we were walking down from the Mount of Olives to go down to the Garden of Gethsemane. And I said, I was walking about 10 or 15 paces behind you, and one of the people on our tour, who was not an Adventist pastor, the tour we took in 11, they had to add about 5 or 6 non-Adventists to our group we didn't know them, they just were part of our group. Well, he was a Baptist minister who believed that Menachem was going to be lost unless he accepted Jesus Christ. And so he spent the whole time from the top of Mount Olives all the way down just badgering Menachem about, you need to accept Jesus Christ or you're going to be lost. Well, I'm walking behind listening to this, and I was embarrassed because this guy was a little bit over the top. I mean, he was really in Menachem's face, and I felt bad for Menachem. So when we walked into Jerusalem, I went up to Menachem. This was 7 years ago, and I said, Menachem, I am so sorry for what just took place. I am embarrassed. You should not have had to go through with that. And I remember then Menachem looked at me, and he said, why would you apologize? And I said, because he claims to be a Christian and he's not treating you in a Christ-like manner. And I am so sorry. As I'm telling Menachem this story, his eyes started to water. And he gives me a hug and he said, my brother. He remembered that story from 7 years ago. So Menachem and I became buddies on this trip. We were always hanging out together and talking. And so I was just so excited that he was back on our tour. And the chances of it was slim to none. So that started our tour in Israel. But the other one I want to tell you has a little bit more to do with this. On the last day of the tour, Sunday, there was 3 museums scheduled museums I had seen before. One of them was the Museum for the Dead Sea Scrolls. One of them was the Israel Museum. And the other one was the Holocaust Museum. I had seen all of them before. They're really good. There's a lot of good stuff in there, but I talked to Trish and Carly and I said, you know what, let's play hooky on the last day. And let's just go off on our own and meander around the old Jerusalem and just do whatever. And they thought that was a good idea, so we went and got lost and had to have an Arab find us and bring us out into where we could figure out where we were going. We went to the Jewish section. Now this is on Sunday, so the Jewish section is open. On the Jewish quarter on Sabbath is totally shut down. There's nothing going on. But it was Sunday morning. It was early, and I got to be careful. I don't want to sound prejudicial, but the Jewish section is one of the cleaner, nicer, more upscale sections of Jerusalem. The shops are really nice, and if you get into the Arabic and the Christian sections, it's not so nice. There was an art gallery, and I'm not an art shopper, but my wife is. And we're going down there, and there's this big art gallery, and Udi was the name of the artist, and he's got all these paintings all over outside of his shop, and there's some really good stuff. And my wife wants to go in there, and as a dutiful husband, yes, dear. I'll wait out here. So she goes in, and Udi, the artist, is in his shop painting on Sunday morning. And my wife really likes art, and everywhere we go, she likes to shop for art and look at art, and I'm not into that stuff, but I love her, so I tolerate her. So she comes running out. She says, come on, you got to come in here and meet Udi. Udi had said, Trish was his first customer of the day, so he gave her a free painting. And she said, you need to come in here because we need to buy something. He just gave me a free one. Okay, dear. So we come in there, and Udi, Ken Coley will relate to this. You don't go in Udi's shop without him talking off both of your ears. For the next hour and a half, Udi told me every story about every painting that he had done in the last 3 years. Very friendly man, very wonderful man. Before we left, he gave us 2 more free pictures. And I said to my wife, I got to get out of here because there's other things I want to see in Jerusalem and I got to go other places. But she's still in there. She calls me back in. She comes and she says, I told him you were pastor. He wants to give a gift to your church back in the United States. He gave us another free picture. It's a print. It's not an original. But this is your gift from Udi. Now, I don't know what to do with this. And I mean this sincerely. I mean, if you don't like it, I don't want to put it up in your church. If you like it, we need to get it framed and hung somewhere. But this is Udi's gift from Jerusalem for you. It's a one of his prints, and he signed it for us. In fact, he signed all the gifts that he gave us. He's really a nice man. We did buy one painting, but we ended up with 4 free ones. So this is Udi's gift to you, and I don't know where to put it where you can see it, but I really think we should probably get it framed and put it up somewhere. But this isn't mine. I got enough of them at home. This one's yours. Now, there was close to 47 pastors on the trip, and I was the only one who got a free picture because I was the only one who went in there Sunday morning to talk to Udi. The rest of them were at the museums, so they missed out on that exciting time. I'm going to, can we get the PowerPoint up here? There are some pictures, and I have some more stories about our trip. Okay. Have any of you ever thought about going to Israel? Are any of you really interested in going? If you are, and if there is a large enough interest, I can arrange for a tour company to come up here and make a presentation to you if you would like to go to Israel. Now, it's kind of nice when you can go as a church because you know everybody. And this would be something that would probably be a year out. We would probably take about a year to pull everything together in order to make all the arrangements. And I'm only going to go with you if Menachem is our guide. Menachem gave me his card, and I said, I'm asking for you if I come back to Israel. I would say that if you've never been there, you should probably go once. It is a very eye-opening experience. Several people have asked me, is it safe? The Israelis understand security better than we do. And it is far safer than many places in Oakland or Detroit. I'm just being honest. It is not. Their security they have no problem with their police officers and their military carrying automatic loaded weapons, and they have no problems profiling, and they have no problems if they feel that there's any threat that they're going to act. So you don't have to worry. But I will tell you one story about my wife that I told my Sabbath school class. Yeah, I'm going to embarrass her. We were at we were in Bethlehem. We were at the Church of the Nativity, and there was a funeral going on, and the funeral was just ending as we were leaving, and I got cut off from the rest of the group because the funeral procession cut me off. And so we have these little earwigs in our ears, and our tour guide can talk to us within a certain reason. If you get too far away, you can't hear them, but we would wear these earwigs, and we'd have these receivers, and the tour guide would be talking, because you can't always be close enough to the tour guide to hear everything. Well, as soon as the casket came out of the church, somebody started shooting off fireworks. Now, you understand, Bethlehem is in the West Bank, and it is part of Palestinian-controlled Israel. And there's been a lot of demonstrations there, and my wife thought they were firing off guns. So she kind of panicked. She got a little nervous. And to top it off, there was a Palestinian demonstration 2 blocks away where they were driving around with their flags and screaming and hollering and blowing horns. And so my wife got a little panicky, but there was no threat to us at any time. We were perfectly safe. It just, there was this anxiety of hearing the fireworks after the funeral. It's not too often you go to a funeral here and people are blowing off fireworks, but that's not unusual for them. So let's pray, and let's see if I can move into a little bit more of a spiritual context. Heavenly Father, please bless us this morning, and guide my words, guide my thoughts. And Lord, may you be glorified, I pray in Jesus' name. Amen. That's not mine. Am I going the wrong way? Sorry. Well, as Josh so ably read this morning, I wanted to start off in Genesis chapter 12, verse 1 to 3, in which this was the calling of Abram, calling Abram out of the land of Ur. And this took place, depending on which scholars, somewhere between 1800 and 2000, some even go as late as 2200 BC, in which Abraham was called, and God said to him, I'm going to make you a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great, and so you shall be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who curse you. And in you, all of the families of the earth will be blessed. So here we stand 4,000 years, and there are 3 major faiths that lay claim to Abraham as their father. All 3 of those major faiths are found in the city of Jerusalem today. And I'm going to share some pictures and talk about some stories, and I want you to get to understand a little bit about the Abrahamic faiths. Going the wrong way again, Ken, I'm sorry. In Exodus 6, verses 1 to 5, we find the founding of Judaism as we understand it. In the Exodus, when Moses was calling the children of Israel out of Egypt, and he brought them into the wilderness, God now formed this group of people into what today modern Judaism will trace their history. The Lord said to Moses, now you will see what I will do to Pharaoh, for with a strong hand he shall let them go, and with a strong hand he shall drive them out of his land. And God spoke to Moses and said to him, I am the Lord, and I appeared unto Abraham and Isaac and Jacob by the name God Almighty. But by my name Jehovah I was not known to them. And I have also established my covenant with them to give them the land of Canaan, the land of their pilgrimage, wherein they were strangers. And so we have the first of the Abrahamic faiths, which is Judaism. Established in the wilderness travels after the exodus of Egypt, approximately, and again, you will have different scholars giving different dates, but approximately 1425 BC is when the children of Israel became formed as what we know today as the Islamic or the Abrahamic faith of Judaism. The primary cultus of Judaism was the sanctuary. By cultus, I mean the major way that they functioned in a religious atmosphere. Their whole lives were totally dedicated around the sanctuary operation. Everything they did as far as their worship was directed in accordance with sanctuary issues, sanctuary relationships. Today, Judaism, as we see it, for the most part, has become largely a cultural expression. They follow certain faith activities. They still are Sabbath keepers, sort of, depending on who you talk to. They still look to the Western Wall, and I'm going to show you some pictures and explain the significance of the Western Wall to the modern Jew. But we have conservative to liberal expressions of Judaism and their understanding of God through those expressions. Every one of our guides was a Jew, but not a Messianic Jew. They're all still awaiting the coming Messiah. Even though they could give you a detailed explanation of every site and everything that Jesus did, they could actually recite stories from the New Testament about Jesus. They could take you to places in the Sea of Galilee and tell you the New Testament story, but yet they were still Jews awaiting the first coming of the Messiah. Now, this is a model. This is not a picture of the actual, but this is a model of what the second temple was believed to look like. So let me see if I can. This is the Temple Mount. And today, on the other side of this wall, on the back, is what we would call the Western Wall or the Wailing Wall. But this temple no longer is there. It was destroyed in AD 70 by the Romans. In fact, the Romans knocked down the walls and they actually pushed stones over, and as archaeologists are digging, they're still finding remnants of the amount of destruction that the Romans did in AD 70 to try to eradicate the cultus of the Jews, which totally was revolved around the sanctuary. Today, this is that Temple Mount. And on it no longer rests the sanctuary for the Jews, but what's called the Dome of the Rock, which is a high holy place for Islam. And if you want to understand tension between religions, you need to be in Jerusalem and to see how much tension there is between the children of Abraham. The Christians, the Muslims, and the Jews. And the tension is all over the place. Now, over here, back up. Over here, you see a mosque on the Temple Mount. And back here, you see a dome. That dome back there is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And we're going to talk a little bit. I've got some pictures of this, but right there you have the three symbols of the Abrahamic faiths within blocks of each other in the Old Jerusalem. You can see the conflict, you can feel the conflict, you can see the tension between the faiths. This is the Wailing Wall or the Western Wall. It is on the western side of the Temple Mount. If you look very carefully, you'll notice that the bricks at the top are different than the bricks in the stone masonry at the bottom. The bottom few rows are original, probably were there from the time of Jesus, but the temple has been destroyed and rebuilt several times since the time of Jesus. And these last rows up here were put in by the Ottoman Turks about 400 or 500 years ago. So one of the things that you need to understand about Jerusalem is that this city has been destroyed 20 times and rebuilt 20 times, and it's not exactly like it was when Jesus was walking on the earth. So you have to use your sanctified imagination as you walk around and see some of the sights in the city. But we do know that the bottom few rows of this were original and would have been there. In fact, this pavement down here, would have been a road that Jesus would have walked on. It would have been there. But this is a symbol for modern Judaism. And they will tell you that the reason it is so important is that it's the closest that they can get to the most holy place of the sanctuary that was destroyed 2,000 years ago. Would they like to have the temple rebuilt? Yes. Is that possible? Not right now, it isn't, because there's some contention over that. But they come and they pray at the wall, and they're praying for the restoration of Israel. And they have these little pieces of paper, and they write their prayers, and they shove them into the cracks wherever they can find a crack and reach them. And you will see some very passionate, devoted prayers who come to the wall, and they pray with tears, asking God to restore them to their previous glory of the first century. Now, as you see these things, and as you understand maybe a little bit from a different perspective, you can be compassionate to their heart. You understand that they're passionate about what they're doing, but they miss something. There's something missing in their religion and in their faith. This is an interesting picture because the Western Wall is separated because it is run by conservative Jews, and they don't allow women and men to worship together. So there is a wall of separation that the women can pray on this side of the wall on the Western Wall, but the men's side is about 80% of the available wall. The women have a very small portion. But it was funny here, you can see this picture of the women looking over the wall. There's a reason for that. There is a bar mitzvah going on. Actually, there's several bar mitzvah going on, and the young boys are going through the ceremony at the Western Wall to have their bar mitzvah completed, and the women are all dressed up watching. They can't be over there with their children or nieces or nephews or whatever, but they could stand and look over the wall and see what's going on. And you can see the men wearing the yarmulkes, the prayer shawls, and the phylacteries. Do you know what a phylactery is? I'll show you a picture that might help a little bit with that. Here's a young man who's just going through his bar mitzvah. He is just completing it. And for a young man to complete his bar mitzvah, he has to recite from memory large portions of the Torah. That's part of the training to prepare for this, is that they have to recite from memory huge passages. So they spend a great deal of time studying, these young men. Now, the girls are not required to do this. The young men are. But if you'll notice on his hand and on his forehead, several people were joking that it looked like GoPro cameras on their foreheads, but those are called phylacteries. And this goes back to the Old Testament, which says to write my laws on your foreheads and on your arms, and to keep them before you all the time. And so the 10 Commandments are found in each of those. And when they go to prayer and they go to the wall, they wrap these up, and so here he's posing for his family, and I was able to get close enough to get a picture of him and not have 400 people in the way because it's pretty busy at the wall. And he's got quite a smile on his face. This is a big day for him. In the Jewish faith, he's becoming a man today. The second Abrahamic faith is Christianity, established in AD 31 by an itinerant rabbi. For the first 100 years of Christianity, it was basically considered a sect of Judaism. In fact, in many ways, you couldn't tell the difference between Christianity and Judaism. They still worshiped in the synagogues. They still kept the Sabbath. They still kept the dietary laws. And so for the first 100 years, if you were outside of Judaism and Christianity, most outsiders thought Christianity just is a bunch of people arguing over some minor things. But Christianity intentionally put space between itself and one of its Abrahamic religions and decided that they were going to move away theologically and ecclesialistically away from Judaism. And so they started to give up on many of the Jewish rules and customs and practices, and they started moving away in dress and adornment, in worship styles. If the primary cultus of Judaism was the sanctuary, the primary cultus of Christianity became the Mass. And for those of you who are not familiar with the Roman Catholic Mass, the Mass was what gave you value. You came to Mass because you could earn salvation by going to Mass. You could earn salvation by going to prayers or going to confession. And so Christianity started to develop some unique practices in their cultus, but it really was kind of an odd expression, and it moved away. Now, if you're sharp, you can see a lot of remnants of the sanctuary service of the Old Testament in the Mass. You can see the incense. You can see the sacrifice through the bread and grape juice, or the bread and wine, is considered to be re-sacrificing Jesus again every time the Mass is being offered. And so the priest in his clothes, when he officiates at the Mass, he is dressing up as similar to the priest of the Old Testament. And so even though the Catholic Church, which was the predominant church that emerged out of Judaism, it kept some elements of the sanctuary in the Mass. Christianity is one of the largest religions today with various expressions. In fact, when we get to, well, let's take a look at some pictures. This is the entry to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. This is that gold dome I showed you in the background. If I could get closer, do you see these pillars on either side? You want to talk about spreading germs, just about everybody who goes in there touches and kisses those pillars. And if you're in a medical field, you're just cringing at the amount of germs that are being left on these things, because people have started to look at this church and the Christian sites almost as if they worship the sites. This church is actually occupied by three denominations. The Eastern Orthodox, or the Greek Church, lays claim to this. The Roman Catholic Church and the Armenian Apostolic Church all lay claim to this church. They all have worship services in this church, and sometimes they have them simultaneously. And there's a cacophony of noise coming out of this church as they war and compete over who can play the organ louder, or who can sing louder, or who can chant louder. Now, there's something kind of interesting in this picture that I didn't do intentionally, but I found out from our tour guide. Do you see this ladder up here? That ladder has been there since 1918. And nobody's allowed to take it down because nobody knew who put it up there. And they argue between the three denominations over who can do what. And so the church is starting to fall apart, and they won't do maintenance and they won't do upkeep because they argue about who has the right or responsibility. And so they're fighting all the time, these three Christian denominations, over the occupancy of this church. It's a good thing we don't fight about stuff. Now, this picture is kind of hard to see, because anytime you go into any of these, they're all hard to see because they're dark. A lot of these churches are so filled with incense, everything in there is covered with the soot. But what you see down here, this is a glass encased, and this is an altar, and inside this altar there's a person kneeling. This is the supposed crucifixion site of Jesus, and they built an altar, a shrine over it, and people come and they touch the rock and they kiss it and they worship the place that supposedly was the place where Jesus was crucified. Now, as you go in this church, it doesn't look anything like any of us had ever imagined the crucifixion site to look like, because they built this big church, this big gaudy church over it. This is another place that will make you cringe. It is a stone that is about 20 yards in front of the altar I just showed you, in which reportedly Jesus' body was laid after the crucifixion. Can you tell what they're doing there? They are laying on it, they are crying on it, they are kissing it, they're rubbing clothes on it, they are lighting candles on it, and they have made this into a site of almost pagan idol worship. It's another one of those germ-infested places that you really don't want to go to. You might want to look at it and take a picture, but you're not going to want to lay down on this rock. You will find that there are a lot of rocks that have shrines built over the top of them because rocks are important. Jesus was crucified on a rock. He was laid on a rock. He was buried in a rock. He was the Garden of Gethsemane. There's a church there in which there's a rock in which they built a church over because this is where Jesus prayed, on this rock. And so as you go through Israel, you'll find an awful lot of rocks have been elevated to worship status. And this is reportedly the tomb in which Jesus was laid. Look familiar? It's exactly how you envisioned it in your mind, didn't you? And on this particular day, now the last time I went in there, there is a door that you go in. It's a one-way. And the last time in 2011, we got to go because the lines weren't very long. But on this particular day that we were in this church, a cruise ship from Russia had just pulled into Tel Aviv, and they were doing a day trip. There was probably 1,000 Russians standing in line waiting to go through this, just circling this thing. And we looked at it and said, we're not getting in line and going through that. The other Abrahamic faith is Islam. It's kind of a latecomer, or at least a latecomer as we would understand it. Approximately 650 AD, the Prophet Muhammad, who actually had spent a great deal of time studying both Christianity and Judaism, and he saw them as failed faiths, is that the people no longer were following and believing what they said they believed. And Muhammad was really turned off by both the Jews and the Christians. And of course, then we understand that Muhammad claimed to have visions, and he was given the book of the Quran. And so in the 6th, 7th century AD, another Islamic faith came up. And they claimed historical connection to Esau, Abraham's son. So that if Judaism came through Isaac, Esau brought about Islam. Now this was a later interpretation. Obviously, Islam cannot trace its origins all the way back, but they try to make that connection. And for those of you who were here when Gerald was here, he talked about some of those connections. Their primary cultus in Islam is based on the Quran. Now they don't have a mass and they don't have a sanctuary as their primary form of worship. But we learned some things, especially when we were in Jordan, because our guides there were Muslim guides, and we got a little bit of insight into Islam. Some of it wasn't real exciting, but the main focus of Islam is less on the temple worship or on a series of worship as it is on prayer, fasting, pilgrimages, and on good works. Now, we learned from our guide in Jordan that if you go to prayer in your local mosque with the calling, you get 1 point towards salvation. If you go to prayer at a mosque or at a location like the Dome of the Rock, you can get 1,000 points. And if you take a pilgrimage to Mecca, we're talking 10,000 plus now. So there is actually a rating system based on pilgrimages and prayers and how you can earn salvation. If you pay attention to the three faiths, there seems that each of them has this component of needing to do something or to go somewhere, to touch something, to worship at a certain site in order to earn the favor of God, to be near God. It's rather troubling. Today, Islam is the second largest religion on the earth. So of the three great Abraham religions, Judaism is the smallest today. Christianity and Islam are kind of competing for the largest, and there's some argumentation there as to numbers and who has what. This is the Dome of the Rock. On that Sunday that we decided to play hooky, we actually went up on top of the dome, and we can go up there. You can go up there. There are certain times that visitors are allowed. Non-Muslim visitors can go up on the Dome of the Rock. You are not allowed to go into the Dome of the Rock. Only a faithful Muslim can go inside, but you can go outside and walk around and take pictures. Now, I noticed when I took this picture that they have a ladder up there too, but I'm not sure if that has the same significance as it does in the Christian church. I don't think it's been up there for 1,800 years. It's a very beautiful edifice, and it was built somewhere around the 12th century. It's been rebuilt several times. Most recently, King Hussein of Jordan was the one who supplied the money to have the gold plating dome rebuilt. One of the things you need to understand is that there are earthquakes in Israel and in Jerusalem, and things get destroyed, and there was a large earthquake in the 17th century, and much of this was destroyed and had to be rebuilt. But it is a beautiful edifice. It is filled with mosaics, and if you look very carefully, there are two primary colors in the construction, and that is green and blue. What do you think the significance of the colors green and blue are? Blue is water and green is life. And when you're a Bedouin in the desert, those are significant. You need water and you need greenery. And so those are the primary colors that are found in here based on that. The other thing that I noticed, and this was something that as we were leaving, this is a ceremonial bath. You can see that there's little stools and there's a fountain here. And that in order for you to go up to the Temple Mount as a worshiper, that there needs to be a ceremonial cleansing. You need to wash your hands and your feet ceremonially before you can be presented or present yourself before God. Well, did you know that the Jews have the same thing? There is a ceremonial fountain in front of the Wailing Wall that you must wash your hands before you can approach the wall. And it started to get me thinking about the need or the issue in religion about washing oneself before presenting oneself before the deity. And there seems to be something in every religion, including Christianity, whether it's baptism or foot washing, there is a symbolic cleansing that takes place in all the major religions. And so there are some similarities, although we may interpret it and practice it a little bit differently, there are some similarities. So, are these the three faiths? Are these the children of Abraham that God talked about in Genesis chapter 12? Through all the nations that they will be blessed. I wonder if Abraham today would shudder if he saw his three descendants and how they function today in the world, and how they have interpreted and expressed themselves in their own spiritual ways. Do they all have a piece of the truth? Yeah, I think they all do have some. There's some good things about Islam. I wish I was as dedicated to prayer as Islam is. 5 times a day, getting down and praying. The care for the needy is a very high esteemed value in Islam, and it is very admirable. Is it admirable when these Jews go to the wall and you could see them crying with tears, praying to God to restore their nation? It's very admirable, and there's a sense of spirituality there that I long to understand. But there's something missing in all of them too. And as I walk around, even in the Christian churches in Jerusalem, I look at what they're doing and how they're functioning, and I wonder, what are you missing? What is it that you don't understand? You're going through these forms and functions, and it's like you're looking for something, but you can't find it. Every one of these Abrahamic faiths seems to have something missing, a piece of the pie, a piece of the puzzle. And yet they argue with each other, they dislike each other, they don't want to associate with each other. And the worst thing that you can do is to claim you have truth. The Muslims claim they have truth, the Jews claim they have truth, and the Christians claim they have truth, and nobody listens to one another. So is the problem truth? Let's just not have truth. Or is the problem we're not listening to the real truth, which comes from God? So as I'm walking through, and like I said, I've seen these sites before, I've taken pictures, and I'm thinking kind of big picture as I'm going through Jerusalem, and I'm wondering, God, what are you doing with your children? These 3 Abrahamic faiths that you promised in Genesis, that you were going to bless as the descendants of Abraham. What's happened to us? what are we missing? Where did we go wrong? Because obviously, nobody's right in all of this, and there's something missing. There's a big piece of the pie missing here. Well, in Malachi 4, verses 5 and 6, God says, Behold, I'm going to send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and terrible day of the Lord. Now, in the Old Testament, you'll notice it says both great and terrible. And that's pretty frequent in the Old Testament, and it almost always is referring to the second coming of Jesus. Before the great and terrible day of the Lord. Now, why is it both great and terrible? Well, it's great if you love Jesus. If you don't, it's probably not going to be so good. So it just really depends on your relationship with God when this happens as to how you will relate or how you will. It's the same God. It's just where you're standing in relationship to Him as to whether it'll be great and terrible. But behold, I'm going to send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and terrible day of the Lord. He will restore the hearts of the fathers to their children and the hearts of the children to their fathers, so that I will not come and smite the land with a curse. So here's a promise that the disciples were aware of, and they actually talked to Jesus about it and said, Jesus, if you're the Messiah, who's Elijah? Because Elijah's supposed to come before the Messiah. Who did Jesus say that the Elijah was? John the Baptist. God did send a messenger to call people back to repentance, to call them back to true worship. Because even in the time of Jesus, Judaism was going off the rails. They were losing sight of the big picture. They were losing sight of the oracles of God and what God had intended. And Jesus said, John the Baptist was the one to call you back. The forerunner, pointing to me. But we as Adventists have understood this in another context. Because Jesus did come, and John the Baptist was the forerunner to Jesus. Will there be another to call the world back to true worship? Will there be another messenger or message that God will send because of His mercy and grace, that He is going to send to the world to clear up all of this misunderstanding and this strange views on worship? And I believe there is. And I believe that God called this group of people into existence about 160 years ago, and He gave them a task and a mission. I saw another angel flying in mid-heaven, having the eternal gospel to preach to those who live on the earth, to every nation, tribe, tongue, and people. And he said in a loud voice, Fear God and give Him glory, because the hour of His judgment has come. Worship Him who made the heaven, the earth, the sea, and the springs of water. I believe God has called a group of people from every nation, language, and people to proclaim a message in the last day that the world needs to hear. A message of God's love and grace. A message that you don't have to go to the Wailing Wall to be close to God. A message that says you don't have to work and pray and earn salvation. A message that says you don't have to go to Christian holy sites and crawl around and kiss the ground. But that we serve a living God who is alive today, who makes intercession for us, who is pleading on our behalf, who today wants to call us into His family, and not just us, but He's asking us to call our loved ones, our neighbors, our friends, and give them an explanation. And as I walked around Jerusalem and I saw what they were doing, and I said, I wish they knew what I knew. I wish they had what I had. Because I believe that this church has been given a gift of a clarity of Scripture and an understanding of the character of God that God has specifically done at this time for a specific reason. And I want to be a part of a group of people like that. I want to be able to put my arm around Menachem and say, you know what, Menachem? I can relate to your belief in the sanctuary and the Wailing Wall because I know what Jesus is doing right now. And I can share the truth with him. And I can also walk up to my Muslim brothers and I can give them information that they're missing, that they don't have this piece of the pie. And I can say to them, you don't have to fear God. He is not a vengeful God. He is a loving, compassionate God. so why are we so reluctant to embrace this message and to share it? Why? It saved my life. And I really believe that it is a message from God. And I am not ashamed to be a Seventh-day Adventist. And I am not ashamed of the doctrines of this church. Now, with that said, are our doctrines sometimes abused and misrepresented? Yes, they are. Which means we have to spend some time studying and praying to know what's right and what's wrong. Because if this is a message for the last day, don't you think there's an enemy who wants to twist and turn and ruin it? Don't you think that there's somebody who's going to work doubly hard to try to destroy anybody who stands up and preaches the truth as it is in Jesus? I do believe that, and that's why we need to be prepared. Please, hear me when I say, I love this church, I love you, and I love the Adventist message. And I am not ashamed to be an Adventist. And I want to shout it from the top of the hills. We have a message for all of the children of Abraham that is relevant, that is viable, and that will answer the questions that they're still trying to pursue, trying to understand. So I want to call you and ask you to take part in this with me. That we become passionate followers of Jesus Christ, that we know what we believe and why, and that we not only live it in the marketplace, but we share it with those who don't know this stuff. They have a need to know, and you have the blessing of knowing things that they can't put these pieces together. Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, Jesus said, if only you had let me, I would have gathered you under my wings. He said this 2,000 years ago. How much more do you think he's saying it today? Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, I love you. I've poured out my life for you. When are my people going to love you like I do? And when are they going to want to care enough about you to share the message?